Well, for those of you who might be here for the first time, I wouldn't blame you one bit if when you sat down in the pew and opened the bulletin, you didn't want to immediately go running for the exit. Because I would have felt the same way a few years ago. If I sat down in a church for the first time and I opened up the bulletin and I saw words like, take up your cross, deny yourself, and I saw song titles that said, take up your cross and the old rugged cross, I would have went bolting for the exit doors. I was at a place back then where those words, those themes, the symbolism of the cross held a meaning that was not very life-giving. I've explained to you before how I grew up in a church in Queens, New York, where at the front of the church there was an enormous 10-foot crucifix, Jesus on the cross, and you could actually see the blood gaping out of these exposed wounds. This crucifix was up year-round, not just for Lent. It was up for everything, for infant baptisms and for weddings. Can you imagine your wedding pictures with the enormous bleeding Jesus behind you? Now, my parents had a smaller version of this crucifix up in our house. It was in their bedroom, directly opposite their marital bed. And when I went to Catholic school, that crucifix was up not in one classroom, but in every single classroom. And it was right in the front of the classroom, right above the blackboard, where we got to look at it multiple times each and every day. And so for me, I came away with the understanding that to be a Christian, what Christianity meant, it was about blood and suffering and dying. I've shared with you before how Christianity is the only faith whose symbol is an instrument of death. It's a torture device. We're wearing around our neck a little torture device. It would be like wearing a little guillotine or a little electric chair around our necks, which I know sounds absolutely absurd, because that was not Jesus' message. That is not the message of the gospel. That is not the good news. And yet in today's gospel, it appears that that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross, deny yourself, and lose your life. Those words have been misunderstood for centuries, and they've done a lot of harm to people. I know many Christians in the LGBT community who lived lives either as a celibate or who married someone from the opposite sex because they thought that that's what it meant to deny themselves. And they thought that their sexuality was not a gift from God, but it was the cross that God wanted them to bear. My own mother was a very devout Christian, and whenever she had hardships in life, she said, well, this is just another cross that God wants me to carry. Are we to carry crosses? Is that what our loving God wants for us to do? I think of Christians of old who would wear these coarse hair shirts under their clothing, and they would beat themselves with whips as if pain and suffering would bring them closer to God. And I explained at the top of the service how Lent seems to be a season about giving up the things that bring us joy, as if being miserable and joyless somehow means that we're going to be closer to God. How can that be right? When Jesus said to deny yourself, he wasn't saying to deny those things that bring you joy. He was saying Deny those things that are keeping you from your joy. I think Reverend Polly Moore said it perfectly in our words of integration. She said, when Jesus said, deny thyself, what he meant was negate and thus undo the illusion of self. I'm sure if you've read any spiritual book about someone's spiritual awakening, no matter what faith tradition it came from, they all point to this same message of Jesus. That the way to spiritual enlightenment is to negate and undo the illusion of self. Now, I know this is a very hard concept to wrap our minds around. So I'm going to share with you a story about Eckhart Tolle that may help you. Eckhart Tolle, many of you know, is a spiritual writer and teacher. Eckhart Tolle's story is that he went through a part of his life as a young man where he was terribly depressed and disillusioned with life and dismayed with living. And he found himself sitting on a park bench and repeating over and over to himself, I can't live with myself anymore. I can't live with myself anymore. Over and over again. And then he awakened. He thought to himself, if I can't live with myself anymore, there must be two selves, the I and the self it can no longer live with. And he came to understand what Jesus and all the great spiritual teachers were trying to explain to us, that we are not two, we are one. I and the Father are one. I and the Mother are one. In order for us to experience this oneness, we must crucify the small self so that we can resurrect the divine self. That's the key to the spiritual life. Crucify the ego self, the small self, and resurrect the true self, the divine self. That's why I love the symbol of the cross now. When Jesus said to take up your cross, that's what he meant. Not be miserable and carry around a torture device with you. He meant negate the ego, undo the illusion of self, die to that small self, and resurrect the true self. The cross for me represents the place where the human and the divine meet and they become one. Christianity is about death, but it's about death and resurrection. And it's not about the next life. Jesus' message was never about the next life. It was always about this one. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is here and now. He said the kingdom of heaven is within you. What he was calling us to do is to die now so we could experience the kingdom of heaven now. That's what Christianity is all about. The great spiritual teachers have called this dying before you die. And in our lives along the spiritual paths, we go through many of these little deaths. And often these little deaths are preceded by times in our lives where we are suffering, where we're dismayed and disillusioned. During a time in my own life where I was struggling, where I was lost, I was led to the teachings of the medieval Christian mystic who was known as John of the Cross. And the words of his that awakened me were, I have abandoned all I ever sought to be, and in dying, my spirit has been released. I'll say it again. I have abandoned all I ever sought to be. And in dying, my spirit has been released. John of the Cross wrote that obviously while he was still alive. He wasn't talking about our physical death. He was saying he died to all he had ever sought to be, what the ego sought. It is why Jesus says in today's gospel, what good is it to get the whole world, but to forfeit your soul? John of the Cross, Jesus, the great spiritual teachers are calling us to die more and more to the false self, to the illusion of self, and to resurrect the divine self. Peter in today's gospel is not quite there yet. Peter in today's gospel is still concerned with worldly things. It's why Jesus calls him Satan. I know that's surprising. Peter's like his best friend, and he's calling him Satan. But it's because Jesus has said, I must suffer and die. And Peter says, no, I don't want that to happen. That's not going to happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're focused on worldly things. And he says, set your mind on divine things. That's what he meant by, any who want to save their life will lose it. But all those who lose their life, to get rid of that illusion of self, you'll save your life. That's death and resurrection. So the season of Lent is about that for us. It's 40 days for us to each and every day undo that illusion of self. It's what I was saying at the top of the service. Get rid of those worldly things of resentment and worry, of mistrust, of impatience, all of those things, so that we can resurrect the divine self, the God self. I'd like to end this morning by the words of Reverend Polly Moore in our words of integration, because I think she sums up exactly what I was trying to say in just 2 sentences. And I hope those 2 sentences will journey with you through the remainder of Lent, and that this new meaning of the symbol of the cross may transform you along the Lenten journey. The whole point of the Christian faith, the whole point of the Christian faith is to turn life into an out of ego experience in which we live and love and serve from the center of our being. The cross is the symbol of the universal human experience shared across all religions of the figurative death of the ego that resurrects and awakens us to our true divine self. Namaste.